Yeah. Thanks for joining us. We are the Super Marcato Brothers, and we're doing a panel today on the human touch. We're going to explore the importance of the human element in video game music, starting from the old days up to where we are now. My name is Carl Bruggeman.
Yeah, I'm Will Bruggeman.
I'm Marty Bruggeman.
And the three of us are actually, in fact, brothers. Carl and
True story.
Host a weekly video game music podcast called the Super Marcato Brothers. We've been doing that for about 6 years, and we're really happy.
Has it been that long?
Yeah. This is our third or fourth year at MAGFest. In the past, we've done a panel on the history of video game music, where we sort of take a chronological look through the history of console and PC video game music. We're going to do something similar today, but as Carl mentioned, specifically focusing on one particular aspect of video game music, which is the human element. And I think it's safe to say that in any artistic field like music, what we really respond to is often the humanity that artists and creators put into their work. And when we look at video game music being this kind of, especially in the early days, like a digital medium, the combination between the human element and the digital element leads us to several interesting facets.
Well, before you get too far on this, we have to introduce our third brother, Marty Bruggeman.
Oh, yep, I'm here.
So Marty is a frequent guest on our podcast.
And a figment of their imagination, but don't tell them.
And he actually hosts a couple other podcasts on the Marcato Network as well. Will and Marty host Underscore, which is a film music podcast. And then Marty also co-hosts Heroes 3, which is a Kung Fu podcast. Yes, so yeah, as far as the human element in video game music, we're going to talk about it in different ways as we move throughout the different eras of game music. And the first thing we're going to do today is talk about the 8-bit era. And I think most of our panel, as far as the importance of the human element, I think we'll want to focus on that era because that was such an important time to try to get expression and music that reminds us of real human music with these really inhuman tools that were used at the time, these really primitive sound chips. And so the music that was achieved in this era in some ways is the most impressive in the history of video game music because when we listen to these classics that we still are humming today and that really bring us back to that world and put us in that world, I think the music is the number one reason for that, for a lot of those experiences.
I think that's true, and a concept that we're going to continue to come back to today is the idea of the Uncanny Valley. It's something that I think some of us are familiar with. Originated when talking about robotics. Essentially, if you're thinking about a robot, let's say you have a robot like something from the Jetsons or Lost in Space, and it's very primitive, but it just sort of barely looks humanoid enough where it's almost sort of cute and appealing. And the idea is that as you approach more human-like characteristics, you approach a zone where it ceases to be cute and appealing, and it almost can become kind of unnerving or uncanny. And the thought is that it's actually quite difficult to cross that valley, so to speak, into the realm where it's synonymous or indistinguishable from humanity. So we'll be talking about that a lot today as it relates to game music.
I would say be aware of that valley and where we are in that valley. We're going to start off today clearly on one side. We're going to call it the cute and plucky side and a non-threatening side of the Uncanny Valley.
Right, where there's sort of no danger of it being mistaken for, say, real performers in front of a microphone or something.
So I think the first thing we're going to do today is we're going to take a very quick listen to the state of video game music before the rise of the Nintendo Entertainment System, really the dawn of the heyday of video games when it was saved from the crash. So if you listen to video game music back in this era, before the NES, before the Game Boy, you might hear something along these lines.
So I think it's safe to say that you can definitely hear the computerized element. The digital elements, these timbres are kind of not really pleasing, and there's
very shrill.
There's not really a lot of humanity in the music, and I think when people maybe of a certain generation or folks who don't have much experience with video games, if you've ever encountered people saying like, video game music, I didn't even know they had music, I didn't even know there was any merit or art to it, I think this is the kind of thing that they're thinking of.
Yeah.
I still think there's value to something like this.
It's more of a jingle. It's a very simple,
Right.
fun
I mean,
jingle.
the limitations, I think, in this case, get in the way of the actual artistic expression. But we wanted to start here to basically, as a point of contrast, to show, in the beginning, I think it wasn't necessarily a given that you could use these primitive synthesizers and crude chip sounds to actually create something that we would really consider a piece of music that would resemble a song.
Right.
There's nothing about this that is evoking anything instrumental in the way we might think of some of our favorite pieces of, chiptune music, where it almost sounds like harmonized rock guitars, or maybe it's supposed to sound like a piano.
Or a human voice
Yeah.
sometimes, yeah. Absolutely. So that's an interesting place to start. Now I do think we want to move into the era of this wonderful console, known over here as the Nintendo Entertainment System. That's just a fun picture we wanted to use. And so before we play some examples from the NES, we wanted to show you guys just the raw sound capability that this sound chip had. It's possible that some of you might not be familiar with this. Obviously, I'm assuming everyone here is familiar with some sort of NES classic music, whether it's Mega Man 2 or Super Mario Brothers, right? But you might not have heard just what the raw sound channels sound like without anything done to them, right? And so we'll show you guys here. What we're gonna play is, it's only 14 seconds, so you're gonna hear long sustained notes, 3 different what are called duty cycles, which are different ways of the pulse channel, kind of different timbres that the pulse channel could produce.
The Nintendo Entertainment System had 3 possible simultaneous pitched voices at one time. There were 2 square channels or pulse channels that produced very simple square waves that had
could be manipulated.
Yeah, and then also a single triangle channel, which was often used for bass frequency, which you had less control over. There was also a noise channel, which basically just outputted white noise.
And that was used mostly for drums, but as you will hear, hearing the raw sound of it sounds god-awful. So let's take a listen to this. You'll hear 3 different pulses, the triangle wave, and then the noise channel. So take a listen. This is what the NES is capable of here.
That's the triangle.
There's the noise channel.
So pretty, right? And
in addition, there was one channel called the DPCM sample channel, which created 1-bit audio samples. And later on, as the NES evolved, different developers would find sort of creative uses for that sample channel. But for the most part, when we're talking about the NES, you can hear it's fairly crude limitations. And part of the inspiration for us to do this panel is seeing how, with those primitive tools, those 4 or 5 sounds that you just heard, really a myriad of some of the most colorful and creative artists to ever work on video games were able to create these soundtracks and tunes and scores that we still remember to this day.
Yeah.
I mean, if any of you had an opportunity to hear some of the live music that's happened at MAGFest, I mean, I think it's safe to say that so much of what a lot of these cover bands play comes from NES music. And I think that's a testament to the real artistry and the kind of pioneering wizardry of people back then.
I like to think about this. If we think about the year 1985, and you would show those sounds to any musician or composer or any normal person and say, can you imagine making beautiful, timeless music with this? They'd say, absolutely not. But that does lead us into our first example that we're going to be talking about on the NES. Now, Marty, this was your idea to bring this example in. So what are we starting with today?
Well, in some ways, this is really one of kind of the leading lights of the Nintendo. So it's not as though we're starting at the very beginning of the history of the Famicom or the NES, but we'd like to play one of our favorite selections. This comes from what we call in the States Super Mario Bros. 2. Has kind of a long storied history, which you can follow up on the internet. But this was like the first Mario game and subsequent games composed by the master, Koji Kondo. And what we'll hear here is Kondo-san using the exact same tools that Carl just played, those sounds, and really nothing beyond that, but by his inventive arrangements, switching between the duty cycles, the volume envelopes that he draws for the instruments, and really just the great composition, the great writing, and the great arrangement, you're going to almost feel like you're in a sort of bigger band, and as though melodies are being handed off to different instruments.
Yeah.
And we'll also hear the final section of the piece has a very free, almost soloistic sort of passage. And it's all in this kind of swung Dixieland jazz feel that would have been very difficult to implement. That Atari 2600 piece that we listened to, it's one of those cases, and sometimes you might encounter this in programming too, where the chip is almost encouraging you what to write, right? Or let's say if you're developing something on an engine or Unreal. Unreal kind of tells you maybe what kind of game to develop in some ways, and you have to kind of push against that. This is Koji Kondo just entering this chip with his own musical ideas and really working hard against the limitations of it, and it's probably one of our favorite pieces of music.
Let's take a listen to Character Select from Mario 2.
So that drum sound, that's that noise channel, that white noise.
So what's really fantastic, we want to mention the noise channel. You can actually select different pitches of it. So part of how they were able to create the sound of almost like a hi-hat and a snare drum is, you use sort of a high pitch of the white noise at a very, short, quick, and then for a snare it's maybe a lower pitch, also with sort of a short attack. So that's how so much of chip drum sounds actually
I know
work.
Marty mentioned this, but for me the most impressive thing, and one of the reasons why it's really great that we're playing this on this playlist, is the very last section. You have that and it really does sound like some sort of stride piano player just kind of noodling around, taking a solo. And the fact that was able to be achieved in this era with the NES is just mind-boggling.
Yeah, there's a lot that's happening in a piece of music like this. I'm glad that Marty mentioned the swung feel. I think that's something, just by its very nature, it kind of hits that, cute peak of the Uncanny Valley, where it's so charming and quaint to us because, swing is a rhythmic feel. It's something that exists in jazz music, and it's something that you don't necessarily overly intellectualize about. It's something that you're meant to internalize. So when we hear like a computer swing, there's something very kind of quaint and charming about that. And I think, honestly, one of the great successes of what Koji Kondo did all those years ago is that we kind of just take that for granted, and we don't even necessarily notice that as being out of the ordinary, because there's so much incredible music that came decades after this.
I think this is a good example of one of the importances of the human touch in this era. Now, Koji Kondo is going for a specific predetermined style,
it's a pastiche,
jazz, Dixieland, ragtime, real human music. So when you hear that on the sound chip, you don't really hear the particular quirks of the sound chip. You just hear the music. You're whisked away to this jazzy place. And it's one way that, with a little bit of imagination, these sound composers were able to whisk us away to these magical lands. So
I think also the writing. Really, there's only ever 3 pitches occurring at one given time. And in this piece, you usually have a melody, harmony, and the bass line. And one of the reasons why I imagine Kondo-san chose this genre was that it allowed for kind of this active walking bass line, where with that triangle bass voice in and of itself, it can kind of imply all of these chords, because instead of just hitting, roots and fifths, it's going boop, 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 boop. It's really active and kind of moving all over the place. So you can just have a melody and harmony sitting on top of that and really get kind of a full sense of the harmony.
So yeah, we're going to move on to the next example. We'll try to go a little quicker through these. The next example we're going to play could not be more different. It is another sequel in some ways. This is Gremlins 2 we're going to move on to. And we wanted to play this because this represents a very unique facet of NES music. This was composed by Naoki Kodaka, who worked for Sunsoft. And the Sunsoft composers really got a lot of mileage and a lot of unique timbres out of the NES sound chip. This particular track uses a sampled bass, so it uses that sample channel that was mostly used for drum sounds and sound effects, and this is actually using it for the bass guitar sound here, which really elevates this whole piece to sound beyond what you'd expect the NES. Also, another thing I want you guys to listen out for here is the way that Kodaka is using the pulse channels on the lead. There's a lot of expression, really kind of wide vibrato, and this piece in general is just very colorful and expressive. Let's take a listen to Ventilation Shafts.
Things about having that DPCM channel doing the bass is you get an additional pitched voice. You can actually have 4 notes happening at once. Sometimes Kodaka-san actually would use the triangle channel that we normally use for bass and just doing this sort of portamento fall to almost simulate like a tom
snare.
Or like a.
I mean, especially if you're playing a game in this era on the NES and you're so used to the sound of the triangle bass and you're accepting that this is the sound palette, when you hear something like this, it's just new enough where you're like, ooh, this sounds really good. I can tell that's supposed to be a synth bass. And just that little added ingredient is just so special.
Well, and there's enough here, with the Mario 2 example, we were sort of, like Carl said, taken away to sort of a jazz or Dixieland place. This sort of feels like rock score, not quite to the heights of Rocky IV like last night for the concert, but really in that vein of sort of like rock and roll sort of score. And it's a subtle thing, but having that sample of the bass, we are actually bringing a microphone recording, in a way, onto the Nintendo. So we're taking kind of our first steps along our path as we will eventually cross the Uncanny Valley.
And there is also expression, as Carl mentioned, the vibrato. It makes it almost sound like a human voice, being able to have that vibrated sound, gives it more expression. And
or like a shredding guitar.
Right? Articulation is a huge
speaking
part
of that,
humanity.
Marty mentioned shredding guitar. We're going to move on to the last NES example today, and we have to play a Tim Follin track. And what's so amazing about really the Follin brothers, Tim and Jeff Follin, that their work on the NES, but really on all the systems they worked on, is they were able to get those, at many times, horrible sounding sound chips to sound badass and shredding and so expressive. When you listen to this lead here, it just sounds like a guitar. You can just imagine the full rock band playing this. So let's take a listen to the title theme from Treasure Master.
Yeah, like the police would pull you over for this, right?
So we've talked about in a lot of our examples today different things that bring out kind of the humanity in these sounds. With Koji Kondo, we talked about genre, the idea of nailing a specific known pastiche that we associate with live musicians and real instruments. That's one way of achieving it. We also talked about articulation in our last example and the use of primitive samples. But in an example like this, we're hearing kind of all of those elements coming together. I mean, it's definitely the groove and all of the rhythmic elements of this piece are so much more complex, but at the same time feel so comfortable. You can really imagine the performer, like the rhythm section, so to speak, the way that the triangle bass channel and the drums interlock, like it's just so in the pocket and so groovy.
I think Tim Follin had a totally different approach to the NES sound chip than almost any other composer. he wasn't necessarily that concerned with what the NES should or could do. He wanted to make the music that he wanted to make, and he did everything he could to make it happen on whatever system he was working on. And that's why when you listen to a Tim Follin track, it almost always transcends that particular system. This sounds so much more advanced than like any other NES track I can think of.
One technique that the Follins would often use, and a lot of Western video game composers tended to do this, and it even happens in a lot of PC music, like the Commodore, for instance. But it's the use of the arpeggiator. Since, as we mentioned, you can really only get 3 pitch voices at one time, when trying to create music that's maybe jazzy or using 7ths and 9ths and needs to be kind of full spelled out harmony, they would use one channel and have it quickly oscillate between pitches. That's where you kind of get that sort of chimey sound. Sometimes it's cycling between octaves just for kind of this like gnarly effect, but other times it will cycle actually through an entire chord. So just using one voice, you get the sound of almost like 3 notes happening simultaneously.
Well, so we've talked a little bit today about timbre, timbre being the sound of a musical instrument or a voice, the particular character that it has. And there is some control with that in this era, but really as we move into the next era, the 16-bit era, composers had a lot more ability to manipulate different timbres, whether it's with custom-made samples or the FM sound chip that the Genesis had, which offered way more variety in the timbre. So we're able to, as a game player in this era, now we have to use our imagination a little bit less. So when we hear a sound on the FM that's really kind of distorted and biting, it's so much more clear that that's a guitar, that's a rock band. The samples sound better. Or on the Super Nintendo, when we hear a harp or when we hear a piano, it's so much more closer to what the real music is. So we're getting a lot closer. Let's play an example of a Genesis game right now. This is a pretty obscure game. It's called Minnesota Fats Pool Legend.
We had to include this because the 3 of us are actually from Minnesota. So
and also, this is just an incredible soundtrack. You guys should really check it out. It's one of the most authentic jazz soundtracks in this whole era. It's just a straight-up swing soundtrack all the way through. There's even a wonderful ride cymbal sample that they use on this. And there's great solos. These improvised moments that in reality were composed and meticulously inputted, but the result, it sounds like jazz. Let's take a listen to Solitude. Let's get to the solo for sure. That's gnarly. It reminds me of just some great sax players where, in the heyday of jazz, where they would play the head once, then the second time it's kind of a classical idea, where they would do all these ornamentations around it and do these solos around it. And it's wonderful to hear that on the Genesis.
What's really cool about a track like this is they're creating the effect of an improvisation. You can almost imagine a keyboard player playing on a piano or like a Rhodes electric piano and kind of improvising this really scalar line and stuff, but it couldn't have been improvised. It was meticulously inputted. But what I love about what this composer did is they really took the time to simulate that effect with these sounds, which I think adds a tremendous level of expression.
And composing for a lot of these systems, it's not so much like, say, working in GarageBand or a modern DAW or something where you're inputting MIDI. It's more like working in a very primitive, almost like DOS spreadsheet with hexadecimal code. So in many ways, I think for a lot of musicians, it couldn't be more unintuitive to imagine these flurries of this improvisational solo
it's incredible.
Being input sort of one cell at a time. It's really something.
So those composers were Shogo Sakai and Masaki Iwasaki. We're going to now move on to a Super Nintendo example. And this is also pretty obscure, and we wanted to play this. This is from a game called Dual Orb 2. Has anyone heard of this game before? Oh, one person. Oh, okay. Well, you host a podcast on video game music, so that's a little unfair, Stephen. But no, that's great. Okay, so we're going to play a track called Harp 2 from Dual Orb 2. And this is a great example of what the Super Nintendo was able to do to elevate the humanity in video game music. It's called Harp 2. It's not a very creative title. So you're going to hear the harp here. And it's so clear right away that this is a concert harp, and it has these wonderful glisses and the sense of rubato and the tempo changes. It really feels like a human performance here. Obviously it wasn't. Let's take a listen to Harp 2.
Some of these phrases, the harp, it almost sounds like the harpist is slowing down. And dun 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 dun. That kind of non-metric feel was very uncommon for the early days of video games.
And listen to the timbre of this flute here too. It's so much closer to what a flute sounds like than what was possible on the NES. So we're already making really significant strides.
I thought it was an oboe. So we're getting closer. But.
It's a woodwind instrument for sure. It is more of an oboe sound, you're right.
The other thing that I think is really effective about this piece, like the writing for the harp, they really make it sound like an actual harpist is playing it. It's not just inputting a melody, but the fact that it has those kind of glisses or arpeggiated chords. There's it takes a little. It I imagine took a long time to kind of get the timing of that feeling right, but it's such an effective thing, and I think it really adds to the experience of playing a video game because it makes you feel, again, the humanity of it kind of can whisk you away to another world.
Well, there's another example on the NES that we want to show that has a similar idea of SNES, of tempo changes. In this case, what this is trying to convey is the sound of a real-life music box that you have to crank by hand, and so there's a human element there, and this track will actually stop at certain points, and you'll hear the crank. This is the first thing you hear in Yoshi's Island, composed again by Koji Kondo. This is Story Music Box. Let's take a listen to a little bit of this.
I don't think anyone does it quite as good as Koji Kondo. I mean, everything about a piece like this is just perfect to me. I mean, the composition in and of itself, it's so pure, it's so elegant. It really sounds like it's this timeless lullaby. But I think it's such a genius idea to implement it with those timbres that really sound like the chimes of a music box. If you notice, he made sure not to make the intonation perfect. Those first few notes are a little out of tune. It sounds like a real thing. And the fact that the tempo kind of wavers and fluctuates, you imagine a little kid turning it on a crank. It's not going to be perfect. And if you listen closely, you can actually hear the sounds of the that's supposed to sound like the turning of the crank. But at the end of the day, none of that would matter if the composition, if the writing of the music wasn't so beautiful. And it's just such a fantastic melody.
And there is a certain point, I think it's coming up in a little bit, where it actually stops, and then you hear the crank and it restarts itself. Yeah, it's just so impressive. I think that will do it for the console era of the 16-bit generation. Now we're going to move into an example from the PC around this same time. So if you were a PC gamer in this time, you would hear some similar sounds. We grew up playing a lot of the LucasArts adventure games on the PC. This was back in DOS.
This is a really fancy computer because it has 2 disk drives, so it's... That's a lot better.
Now, there should be a mouse here if we're trying to be accurate. You do need a mouse to play this game. But so we're going to play an example from from Sam & Max Hit the Road. The track is Doug the Mole Man, and this is using the Sound Blaster, which is a very similar sound to the Sega Genesis here. But what's really impressive about what these composers at LucasArts were able to do is this whole score is a jazz score. And it's scored in a very similar way that you would score some sort of kind of swanky film noir detective movie. And
the game is almost like it's playing off of old film noir and buddy cop movie cliches, and the music is kind of playing the straight man. You know, it's taking it seriously, and it's trying to immerse you in that ambiance, and then all of the humor of the game is kind of juxtaposed with that, I think.
Well, and this is the first piece of music that we're listening to today that wouldn't have been implemented in that sort of spreadsheet fashion. This would have been MIDI performed. So we're hearing an actual human person, in this case, Peter McConnell, performing these individual parts.
This is a real performance. Let's take a listen to Doug the Mole Man.
Sort of imperfect the beat is there.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons we chose this example, is because I think all of you can hopefully hear this, that there is something imperfect going on here. There's something a little bit off, and that's intentional. This game is a very comedic game, and Doug the Mole Man, particularly as a character, is a really funny character. And so I really liked the fact that you, even on the Sound Blaster, you could hear how the rhythms are a little bit off, but it works really well. And knowing now that this was all captured on a MIDI keyboard, one part at a time, the melody, the bass, the chords. And so there's something very human and very charming about this.
Well, at the end of the day, I mean, it was a human performance. It was capturing someone actually playing these lines. And I think whether you're hyper aware about, oh, this rhythm is early or this rhythm is late, it's not even anything like that. It's just, I think hopefully subconsciously you'd be able to kind of intuit that added humanity and emotion that comes through a live human performance. And again, just a great composition that's kind of nailing a very improvisatory, kind of swanky jazz sound.
Yeah, I think there's two elements of this that make it a great contender for today's panel. Is that one, it's going for an outside style, so that immediate connotation of that swanky jazz, we a lot of us have heard that before, so when we hear it, even if it's on this primitive sound chip, we automatically know that connotation. In addition to that, you are hearing that real performance and that sense of imperfection, which is actually really appealing sometimes. So now we're going to move on to a really interesting turning point for video game music. So this was an era, and we're kind of fudging the chronology a little bit here, but this is an era when CD audio started to become used for video game systems. And that was really, really important, because a lot of composers, many times different people that weren't working in the 8-bit era, were now being tasked to score games, a lot of times in very different ways. And some of the traditions of the 8-bit and 16-bit systems were kind of thrown out, and you were able to have full, fleshed-out recordings that you could record at a studio and put it on the disc. So this was an era when video game music saw a lot of changes in a really short amount of time. Let's show you an example of a pretty early piece of video game music that is a full recorded track. This is for the Sega CD here. This is composed by Tommy Tallarico. It's from the game The Terminator. Let's take a listen to Future Shock.
Quite a far cry from that first Atari track, don't you think?
We've come a long way. And what's interesting is now that we've gotten to this example, there's almost no turning back. Like once this technology was available and was used, there's a reason why there were some people, some composers, some designers that they didn't want to go back to those old sounds. If they wanted a fun Terminator game with shooting and a rock sound, it's so great to actually get that real guitar performance.
And drums,
but there is something, and not necessarily an example like this, there was music in this era that I think these composers maybe went a little too far and got a little too trigger happy with using some of that technology. And so some of that music of this era, I am of the opinion that doesn't quite hold up as well as some of the classic 8 and 16.
Well, some of it, even though there are real recordings involved, a lot of the early CD-ROM games or CD-based consoles, it'd be sort of a mix of kind of like a one-man band where maybe it's a real guitar, but maybe fake drums and fake synths. And so we're still not, in some of these projects, still not quite in sort of a full-fledged, rock production or film
Well, I think
score
we're also
production.
dangerously getting close to the Uncanny Valley, the very center,
I
where
think we are,
some of these
yeah.
elements are real and some of them aren't. And it's starting to feel a little bit weird. Like, before it was charming because we knew it was fake, and they were trying to make these old chip sounds sound real, and that was very cute, and it wasn't threatening
It's
at
almost
all.
like, yeah, oh look, the computer's making
Yeah,
music.
how
Like, that's
cute.
so adorable. And now it's almost like something is
Because it's not
not
quite
quite right.
as good as a film or an actual song
Can
on
we
the radio.
play an example of something right in the valley?
Let's do it. And this, honestly, we kind of picked this. We plucked it almost at random. We could have picked almost anything from this era.
We're not talking about the composition or.
So
the
yeah, this isn't. We're not
the
saying we
value
don't
of the
like
music
this
itself.
piece or this era, but we do want to play something from. This is from a PS1 game. We're gonna play a track from Spyro the Dragon, and what you'll hear here, if you listen to the instruments, it's all virtual instruments of the mid-late '90s, which do not hold up very well nowadays. And so it's interesting that so many games in this era chose to use that palette, that sound palette. And in our opinion, this is approaching the very apex of the Uncanny Valley, where you can tell it's not real, but it kind of needs to be more real than it is.
Or needs to be more fake.
Or more fake.
synth-
And so it's
yeah.
kind of in this weird middle ground. Let's take a listen to Sunny Flight. So I think what you'll hopefully hear here is that the music is pretty authentic as far as what actually is happening. This is Stuart Copeland, who's a wonderful drummer, wonderful musician, and pretty prolific composer. And so these parts, like especially that drum part, sounds really nice and very active, very busy. But the sounds, these 90s virtual instrument drums, these General MIDI sounding drums, they just don't quite hold up, and there's something awkward about it. Because if you heard this drum part on an NES noise channel, I think you'd be like, oh, he's trying to be funky on the NES. Whereas
Or with
here,
the live
it
drums.
feels like I want it to be live drums. And the fact that it's not, it's something about
I think
it's off.
the comparison I would make would be if you're listening to an NES track that's just kind of, whistling out a melody and it uses vibrato, as opposed to kind of like if you've ever heard like a digitized computer voice, I don't know, like an old Speak and Spell or something, and you imagine that trying to see something like they did that occasionally in some old video games. Like we played an example years ago on the podcast as sort of a joke of like the national anthem, and it's and it's like
Really bad.
It's so uncanny because it's like it's getting closer to the sound of a human voice than just a primitive synth, but because it's falling in that space, it becomes like unsettling. And I think these drums and I think other elements of the production of this track fall into that place where it's clearly, you can tell what it's going for, oh, this is supposed to be a guitar, this is supposed to be a snare drum, this is
Right.
supposed to be a harp or whatever is happening. But you can also tell that it's not the real thing. And I think sometimes that can become distracting.
I think some of that proof is in the pudding when you think of all of the music that we encounter as we're kind of walking down the corridors of MAGFest or checking out bands. There is kind of a shortage of music from this period, generally. And I don't think that's necessarily means that there isn't quality music of this period. There absolutely is. But there is something really special about being kind of earlier along on that side of the Uncanny Valley that we.
Well, let's now move to when we've just gotten past that side. This is a very early example of that. This is another LucasArts game. We're going to play a track from Curse of Monkey Island, which luckily had enough of a budget, enough of a foresight to have mostly real recorded instruments, pretty ahead of the time too. So what you'll hear here is a full-on band, really swanky. It's kind of like a reggae meets jazz. It's really cool stuff. And listen to what the human element adds to a piece like this. This is mocking the Voodoo Lady from Curse of Monkey Island. So in some ways, there's, at this point in our panel, there's really no turning back. We don't have any other examples really to show you as far as like the technology changing. Once we've gotten to this point, this is where we are, and you can
in terms
do
of
anything
examining
you want.
the human touch,
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
You can have real players. You can have full soundtracks where it's fully orchestral. It's a full rock band. It's a jazz ensemble, and these composers at LucasArts, Peter McConnell especially. We could play tons of examples from him, from the Sly Cooper series, from Grim Fandango. As we move on in the chronology of games, it becomes more and more standard for there to be real performance in video games. And so now the sense of the human touch is fairly obvious at this point,
Right.
for all of us.
One of the reasons we wanted to play this track is Michael Land had worked at LucasArts for a number of years. He composed the original Monkey Island and worked on almost every game in that series. But that Sam and Max track that we played, Carl mentioned was Peter McConnell, but that score was done by Michael Land, Peter, and Clint Bajakian. And so what's kind of interesting about a track like this is you sort of hear, it's almost proof that this is the kind of thing that they were going for in the earlier days of LucasArts, even though they had to use, FM synthesis or early General MIDI with something like Sound Canvas. But yeah, it's kind of cool to think about those composers, all of the decades that they put into having to deal with these primitive restrictions and limitations, and getting to the point where they can kind of run free, and anything that they could imagine musically they can feasibly do.
One of the first consoles where we started to see quite a bit of consistent performance on soundtracks, real performance, was the Dreamcast. We're going to play an example of a track from Shenmue. This is Nozomi's Confession, and this is composed by Osamu Murata. And this game does feature some sequenced music, but there is a lot of real performance in this score. Let's take a listen to this track. This is a pretty delicate piano ballad here. So I really think that the technology and the budget and the ability to incorporate these real recordings in the score really did inform the composition, because these composers knew that we were going to be able to get this performed by a real player, and so I think you can go a little further into making this extra romantic and really authentic to just a love ballad here.
When you think of the production value for games of this period, even if we're not necessarily paying much attention to the soundtrack, I think that goes a long way to sort of feeling like we're maybe in a new era of a game, or sort of a new caliber of a game production.
And just think of all the wonderful JRPG scores, ever since the early 2000s to now. There's so much wonderful real piano and orchestra and vocals. And we had examples that we didn't have time for today. A wonderful songs with vocals. We had an example from Final Fantasy IX, and there's just so many great examples we could play of pieces of music that feature singing and solo violin and piano and guitar, and that is all over the place. And as every year that we move on, in the chronology of video games, that becomes more standard. If we think about even Nintendo, the difference of this past year versus even a few years ago, it's just delightful. I mean, almost everything in Mario Odyssey was real. Almost everything you hear, there's some sort of real guitar, real horn, and that was not the case even a few years ago.
Yeah.
So
We're sort of at an interesting place right now where I think, by and large, you could almost categorize video game scores into sort of two camps. There's the relying heavily on real recordings, and then there's maybe the throwback, embracing the chip sort of sound.
the Shovel Knights, if you will.
And there's something sort of exciting about that, and really kind of any point along the spectrum can absolutely be an aesthetic worthy for video games.
I think what we were particularly fascinated by exploring this idea was where we started in the 8-bit era of back then. It was essential that you were able to inject some sort of humanity in that music, because if you think about the graphics of a Nintendo game, there's not a lot there to really whisk you away into that world. You have to use so much imagination. The gameplay, same thing, but the music really was had a really important role of, if you had this really fun, jazzy bass line with a really soloistic, playful melody, it does kind of let you just kind of put your guard down and use your imagination and just have fun. Whereas now, with things like this, we don't have to use our imagination as much. In any aspect of the game, the graphics, the gameplay.
It becomes more explicit, really. Yeah.
I think another thing, though, is this idea of the Uncanny Valley. It applies to things other than music. I mean, I think graphically there's a similar space where we go back to playing maybe NES games, Super Nintendo games, Genesis, Nintendo 64, PlayStation, but there gets to be a point where it doesn't really look good anymore. Like, I love playing the Nintendo 64, but those blocky 3D graphics don't hold up as well as, Super Mario World.
I think there was a similar timeline of when graphically and musically we did reach a point of that peak of the Uncanny Valley. It could have been the 64 and PS1, could have been that exact time when that happened, where you go back and play NES and there's something charming about. I mean, pixel art is thriving as it ever was. There's something so cool about that look. We have a wonderful pixel artist here in the room with us. But when we get to that era, particularly for me, the PS1, but yeah, definitely some 64 games as well. Yeah, it's hard to go back and play Perfect Dark, especially the multiplayer mode. It's really tough to have that 5 frames a second, those really blocky hands. It's hard to go back to that.
Well, there's something exciting about our video game era now where whatever aesthetic you're encountering in a game, it's done usually with a lot of intention. It's pixel art because of how that kind of character might make you feel. There's a really great book called Understanding Comics that has really wonderful coverage of, say, taking the spectrum of like a simple smiley face that you might draw when you're a little kid, and then sort of a photorealistic drawing, and it kind of charts the different ways that added amount of detail makes you feel, and that's something that we can use as game designers and definitely as composers.
I think we're going to now open it up, hopefully a little dialogue with some of you. We're going to softly play the main theme from Journey as we kind of maybe get into the mood for this audience interaction portion here. So we're wondering if any of you have any particular questions related to either the human touch. It could be about video games, music. Really, we want to hear from you guys. What are your thoughts? Does anyone have any questions at this point?
Observations?
Yeah, absolutely. If you wouldn't mind standing up.
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
that's one of
that was one of my
for
highlights.
me. That was one of the really delightful implementations, and they're using kind of emulated sounds. It's not like it was actually tracked in Nintendo, but it's wonderful how immediate that effect is, right?
Well,
especially when you combine going into 2D and hearing that music. It's striking.
Well, I was impressed with the amount of detail that they took, because a lot of these songs have so many different, like, almost solo sections, and so much of that stuff was was implemented, with
Right.
those 8-bit sounds. So yeah, I was really impressed with that. I thought that was one thing that wasn't spoiled for me. Sorry, spoiler alert. Anyone who hasn't played Odyssey, but yeah, just the idea that those sections were in the game.
In the Steam Gardens track, there's this kind of B3 organ solo
Yeah.
that feels like it was just improvised
And
by
that
the
was
player.
inputted exactly.
And then when you go into the 8-bit version, it's like the exact timing and notes of that were done in 8-bit style, it's just fun that they took the time to have those little details.
I'm actually curious. I kind of have a question for all of you. Does anyone have a particular example of maybe when you were growing up, some of the first games you ever played, where a piece of music moved you in a way that surprised you, where you had this emotional response that maybe you weren't expecting from a Super Nintendo or an N64 or anything like that? Does anyone have
Or it could
an
be
example
from your
of that?
iPhone or really anything. How about right here?
Just like in the MMO world, I used to play RuneScape a lot.
Yeah.
I noticed the shift in the music. So if you were in a quiet area, it was very serene. You
Right.
have a harp sound.
Right.
But then
Yeah.
you go into the wilderness where you can die from players.
Yeah.
It has a much more intense feeling. And those kinds of sounds, I think they really help that.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but RuneScape was also really interesting because didn't the music almost over the years, like they added more music and it got more
Right.
like of a budget, and there was like actual, I think, real performance
James
in that
Hannigan.
series, right?
Yeah, they do that now. But yeah, they definitely progressed in that area.
Very cool. Good memory.
It's like hearing it, I don't know what you would call it, the sound that they for
Sure.
on the job.
Just that very environmentally specific sort of music and how
That's
much of
great.
an impact that can have.
Yeah. Does anyone else have a memory like that to share?
The title screen to Double Dragon on Nintendo.
Oh, that's,
Completely froze me, and I just sat and listened to the music. Like that was like one of my first things.
that is a classic.
Did you
title,
hear
Double
any
Dragon.
sort of ensemble in your head when you heard it? Was like, this is a rock band, or?
It's a rock band. You can see the guitar.
Oh, that's great.
That's great. Let's go over here.
Probably mostly because it was one of the first not like stupid kid money cash grab games I ever put. Like one of the first games I played, it was actually like a real game effort put into it. Like the opening songs to both the Kingdom Hearts games and PlayStation.
Oh yeah.
Yoko Shimomura.
Yeah, she's amazing.
And that's a great example because that was, for at least for the first Kingdom Hearts games, it was all like sequenced virtual instruments, but there was a lot of nice performance, piano and stuff, and that was a time when you can get convincing general MIDI sounds on the PS2.
Well, I think at the end of the day, it's like what matters most is the composition.
Yeah.
I sort of mentioned that with the Koji Kondo thing. I mean, there could be someone who could say that NES music and Super Nintendo music is also in the Uncanny Valley.
Sure.
I mean, it's kind of a subjective thing.
And there's a lot of nostalgia goggles that are
Right.
applied to that music, and if you don't grow up with it,
at the end of the day, it's like if something is a well-composed piece, if something has a good melody or a good groove or something about it strikes you,
Mm-hmm.
it almost doesn't matter. You don't need it to sound like $1 million
Yeah.
recording. You don't need a full orchestra. You can do it. You can make great art with anything, and I think that's
Well-
what was really inspiring looking at some of these tracks today. Is some of our favorite music that we played here was the stuff done back in the 80s with these strict limitations, and it's almost in spite of or because of the ingenuity that was needed dealing with those
also,
limitations.
one thing we didn't get to discuss, but really when you think back to Nintendo specifically, there was a long period of time, 5, 6, 7 years, when they were flirting with the line of the Uncanny Valley. If you listen to Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and Wind Waker, all three, and even a little bit of Twilight Princess, but 3 full Zelda games that basically sounded almost the same. I mean, general MIDI sounds. If you listen to Wind Waker, the music is so wonderful, but the sounds that you have there, they didn't really advance very much from Ocarina of Time. It took so long to finally get real performance.
Well, then they took the great approach with Breath of the Wild, just silence, which is really, really a beautiful, beautiful thing. No,
Jackson,
there's some wonderful, beautiful Breath of the
Yeah.
Wild music.
Do you have a
obviously.
memory?
Yeah, it's sort of more of a guilty pleasure, but Pokemon Puzzle League for the N64.
Oh.
We did a lot of really MIDI versions of a lot of Pokemon songs from animation,
Mm-hmm.
and they kind of just put instruments into there and kind of did the same kind of things. But I love it so much is because
Yeah. Like a crossover, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And there was a lot of fun memories like that in the video game world, things like DuckTales. When you start up DuckTales on the NES, it plays that awesome theme song.
Or
from the
Ninja
cartoon.
Turtles or something.
Yeah, and then taking that and then running with it with the original music of DuckTales, which is still fun and cartoony and could feel like it could exist in that same world. Right. So yeah, some of those crossovers are really cool. I think what we're going to leave you guys with, we're going to talk a little bit about, do some plugs here at the end, and then we're gonna play a little bit of this as we do that. I think it's only fitting. Who here has not played Mario Odyssey yet? All right, you should all do that for sure. So, so like we said before, we are the Super Marcato Brothers. We host a video game music podcast, and that is our website there, supermarcatobros.com. In addition to that, we are also composers. We compose for indie video games, and one of the things that we've kind of been known for in the past few years is we've made quite a few homage albums in which we compose original music in the style of a specific game or composer. And when we do that, we use all those limitations. So, for example, we have an album called Mega Buster, and we made that album using the tools of the NES. We used FamiTracker to make original music that was in the style of the Mega Man series, specifically Mega Man 1 and 2. We've also made Hello World, which is a double album that was in the style of Mario World 1 and 2. We've also done Sonic, Kirby, Metroid, and so that's something. If you guys are curious to check out, we have some business cards. Feel free to check out our website. All of our original music is there, as well as our podcast. And if you have another question that you couldn't think of today, you can get in touch with us there. Otherwise, we'll be here hanging out and talking. Also, I'm sure you'll catch us sometime later this weekend if you want to say hey. We'll be here, and hopefully we'll be back next year with another panel idea. So, and yeah, I'm really glad that we had no kids that got lost this year, no shutdowns. Was anyone at our panel last year? It was, yeah, last year there was an emergency and our whole panel had to get shut down. And so I'm glad that didn't happen.
It was too real. It was too
Yeah, things got really real. We started talking about Spyro the Dragon, and it's just fist fights, chaos. It was crazy.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming by, everybody.
Yeah, thanks a lot, everybody.